Okay. Okay. Good morning to everybody. This is the first session that will be in English, and I'm very glad of the panel of people that are here today, because this panel is formed by some of the most leading scholars in science communication at international level. And we decided to set up this panel because we want to discuss with our guests some of the current issues and the future perspective for or dominant ideas for in science communication in the next years. This is the topic of our panel, and we are very honored to have these three speakers. First of all, because I repeat, they are among the most important scholars in the field of science and technology studies, sociology of science and science communication, of course, but even because they have recently published in last year, or not more than last year, three important books about research in science communication, which on one hand they give the feeling that science communication has really become let's say, an academic discipline, in my opinion, but I will discuss this with them. And on the other hand, they also show the richness of the field, the multi-perspective approach, the pluri-method approach regarding issues in science communication. Our guests, I will present them briefly. The first one is just here, of course, you can see in presence, is Massimiano Bucchi, who is Professor of Science and Technologies in Society and Director of Master SCICOMM at the University of Trento. Massimiano Bucchi is one of the most important sociologists of science in Italy and at the international level regarding science communication field. And among the long list of publications related to science communication, Massimiano is also one of the editors, together with Brian Trench, of this book, the Routledge Handbook of Public Communication on Science and Technology, which is a long story because I think the first edition was published in 2008, but this year in 2021, you can see the new edition of the book, which is one of the, I think, most relevant volume devoted to different issues in science communication. The second guest is Sarah Davies. Sarah Davies is a professor of science and technology studies at the University of Vienna. She also has written a lot about science communication and about a cultural perspective on science communication. This is the last book she devoted to research in science communication that she wrote together with, she's the editor, together with Ulrike Felt, of the book Exploring Science Communication, which it has been published, I don't want to be wrong, it is published in 2020. And the last guest is, I apologize if I don't pronounce it correctly, Professor Annette Leßmöllmann. Professor Leßmöllmann holds a chair of science communication and linguistics at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, and she's one of the editors of this other book titled Science Communication, which has been edited with other colleagues of Professor Leßmöllmann, which has been published in 2019. So welcome to Massimiano Bucchi, to Sarah Davies, to Annette Leßmöllmann, who are connected with us. And I will start asking you to comment the following question. From your point of view, from the point of view of different, you are three different persons that are involved in research in science communication in this important publication, I would like to know something about your, some opinion about which are the different strategies today to study science communication. I will start with Massimiano Bucchi, and then Sarah Davies, and then Annette Leßmöllmann. Please, Massimiano.
Thank you, Nico. It's can you hear me? It's a great pleasure to be back here at the CISA, and with also with the two colleagues, Annette and Sarah, to discuss the study of science communication. I think. I think, by the way, Annette wins for the biggest book, at least. I will start by trying to answer the title of this panel, How to Study Science Communication. For me, the general answer is very simple, and it, for me as a scholar, and it goes back to the classical statement by Galileo. Remember that the book of nature is written in two different languages, the language of mathematics, and the other language is the language we can access through empirical observation. So for me, if I think about my study of science communication, it's always been like this, trying to balance and combine the theoretical study, trying to, for example, come up with more understandable and analytical, precise models of science communication in society, because I am a sociologist trained in the history of science, but also studying it empirically, collecting data about public perception, about how science is communicated, how science is perceived, what scientists think of the public, for example, which sometimes, as we know, unfortunately, is totally missing from conversation. Even during this pandemic crisis, we have often heard scientists and policymakers talking about how science should be communicated without any understanding or any concern, for example, for studying the public, what the public actually thinks about science and scientists. So I took seriously the task that Nico gave us, and after giving this general answer, I tried to write down what should we study for studying science communication, which is a very interesting question, at least for me. So when I started, sorry for the biographical reference, you know, when people become old, they start to talking about. But when I started, I started thinking about science communication when I was a master student. That was a long time ago, 30 years ago. And at the time, the typical publication was in journalism studies, and it was about basically the abstract was always the same. How terrible science communication is, how terrible are the media writing about science. And so what was studied at the time was basically the media. It was the idea of studying the content of the media, and the conclusion, as I said, was often tragic. And then of course, you know about the public understanding of science movement in the UK, started in the mid-80s. Then, of course, the study of the public, of society. So these were the two pillars. These were the obvious point to start. But as a sociologist, and having read books like the classic book by Thomas Kuhn, for example, about the structure of scientific revolutions and the interplay of, even if Kuhn is not very explicit about this, between science, culture, and society in a shifting of paradigms, in revolution, and especially the book by Ludwig Fleck, which for me has always been a guiding light about the genesis and development of a scientific fact. I started to think basically this very simple idea, which I think today is quite obvious, particularly in a place like CISA, how can we study science communication without studying scientists and without studying the role of scientists in science communication? And how can we disconnect what we call and how can we disconnect what Okay.
Dovrebbe funzionare tutto adesso.
Okay, now I think I'm starting to understand what I said before by hearing it again. Okay, and so I started to think about and how can we disconnect public communication of science from what's happening in terms of communication within science. So I will conclude, Nico, don't worry. So this is my
Sorry.
Okay, and so I started to think about and how can we connect.
Sorry.
Okay, so I will conclude my first short list. I mean, the media, what we should study, in my view, to study science communication today. Obviously, the media. We have a greater variety of media today that we still have to understand how they are shaping science communication and the perception of science communication. Let me just make an example. I'm sure when I talk about media, you are thinking about social media nowadays, but I will tell you about a medium that for me, it's very interesting. Like, for example, what I call the festive science format. FameLab, 3 minutes shows, the researcher's night. What are the long-term consequences of presenting science in this way? For example, for the perception of what scientists do and how do they communicate. I think it's a huge experiment that we have to study, and some colleagues are actually studying it. Then, of course, we should study scientists, not just scientists in terms of key actors. We know this is another. I think we will go back to this point. This is a very important trend today. Science communication is moving from the media, as we used to know it, from research institutions. We have more and more also through social media, major players of science communication. We should study that. We should study what scientists think of the public. What do they think of society? How do they consider media? How do they think about public engagement? And of course, there is a lot of variety in there. Scientists have different attitudes. Never forget, we are talking today about a population between 5 and 6 million scientists. It would be silly to say scientists think like this. Then we should study popular culture. With Brian, we explored this idea that we can describe science communication as the conversation about science, which is a very broad, which includes everything. Includes, for example, fiction. We know fiction is has been very, very relevant in shaping our the public ideas about science. We should study the history of science communication. We should study the visual. Again, the pandemic has given us a lot of examples of the visual element, how science communication is presented visually. So I think I will stop here, Nico, for the moment and leave it to the colleagues.
Thank you, Massimiano. Please, I would like to have the perspective of Sarah Davies on the different strategies to study science communication.
Thanks, Nico. Before I start, I wondered if it was possible to very briefly turn the camera around so that we can just see the room. I have no idea who I'm speaking to, and if it's convenient, if it's possible, it would be really nice.
It's much better than view, I can understand. Sorry. Okay.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see you. I really wish I could be there in person. Of course, the situation means that that's not possible at the moment, but I think it looks a great event. And I can also see from the program that many of my colleagues and friends are present. So yeah, I hope you're having a great time. And thank you, Nico, in particular for the invitation to participate and be here at least remotely. So how to study science communication? So I also have a few reflections on this question that will pick up, I think, on at least some of the things that Massi has already said. The first thing I want to say is that, of course, we should do it. We should research and study science communication. And I mean that in the broadest way. I think it's important to incorporate reflection onto our practices. In any case or context where we're doing public communication. So research, I think, for me, is just an extension of these reflective moments and experiences that we can bring to the activities that we are involved in. The other starting point that I have in thinking about this question of how to research science communication is that science communication is we use one word to capture this huge, rich, and diverse ecosystem of different formats and different kinds of people doing different kinds of activities for different reasons. So again, this comes across, I think, also in Matthew and Brian's book. The definition that I operate with around science communication is a very broad one. So we have this kind of really varied set of practices, again, as Matthew has said, not just the media, but going into all kinds of live formats, social media, science communication in activism, all the different ways that lay people access and negotiate and come to understand scientific knowledge. So we have this rich ecosystem. This means, I think, that when we think about research into science communication, we need a similarly wide and rich range of approaches and perspectives and methods as well. So again, there is no one answer to this question of how to research science communication. We need probably an equally rich set of methodologies and people from different disciplinary backgrounds. Having said that, though, in the time that I have, I do want to argue for one form of research in particular, because it's the one that I am most closely engaged with and that feels most at home to me as someone from science and technology studies. And this is studying science communication in a way that is open-ended and exploratory. And again, to pick up on Massey's point, looks at it as an aspect of culture. So this means, I think, that at least some of the research that we carry out into science communication should ask very open, very broad questions. What is happening here? What do people think that they are doing? How do they talk about science communication practices? How do different people understand a particular format or process or aspect of science communication? This is in many ways kind of drawing on ethnographic approaches where you enter a culture and seek to understand how meaning making is done within that culture without imposing particular predefined ideas or assumptions about what is going on. I think this is important in science communication because often in science communication practice and research, we have some quite clearly defined ideas about what is happening in these situations. So the clue seems to be in the name. If we ask what is going on in science communication, okay, science is being communicated. So we already have some ideas about what is happening. Often I think we have particular assumptions as well about that being a good thing, something that should be improved or made more effective, something that should seek to persuade or to change behaviors. I think these points of view are an important part of this ecosystem of research. But again, I would like to suggest that we also need research that is much more open and that takes nothing for granted. One example from my own research is science festivals. This is something that I have looked at and studied in exactly this more open way. So trying to figure out what is going on in a science festival. Again, I think from the outside or as a starting point, the answers seem to be kind of obvious. So science festivals were things that scientists got involved in because they wanted to communicate their research, and that lay people and publics came to because they were interested in the content of that research. That would seem to be the key dynamic. But in this case, what we found just by watching and talking to people was that actually there were many more rationales, there were many more forms of meaning making going on in this particular science festival. So scientists were involved because they cared about their research and they wanted to share it, certainly, but they were also involved because they wanted to perform themselves as good academic citizens to their institutions. They wanted to show their funders they were a particular kind of research. They wanted a possibility to meet up with colleagues from across the world who were going to be involved as well. Or they wanted a venue for a personal hobby of photography and making images that was not so connected to their research, but that they really loved and enjoyed. And wanted a space to display. Similarly, I think the audiences who came also had a wide range of motivations and ways of making sense of what was going on. Certainly, they were kind of interested in the science, but they also saw this as a nice day out, as a way to do something with their family, as an opportunity to be outside, as a way of finding very specific information from specific people. So again, a whole range of motivations. What I want to say then, just with that example, is that what is at stake within science communication is not obvious, and therefore some of the research that we do should be open to noticing these unobvious aspects of this thing that we call science communication. The final thing I want to suggest is that this call for different forms of research in a landscape where there is so many different forms of science communication practice, this also means that we should, I think, strive for networking and connections and building bridges between these different disciplinary approaches, these different methods, these different ways of studying science communication, and also, of course, between researchers and practitioners. So finding spaces such as this one, where people from different backgrounds with different experiences of science communication can share their knowledge and their experiences and learn from each other. And I hope that's what we will kind of continue to do in the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think that you and Massimiano, I can see that you agree in stressing the fact that there are much more research in science communication that we are used to consider obvious. I mean, there science communication, it is not just for translating facts, it is not just even scientists. When they communicate, I think what Sarah said is very interesting concerning the reasons why scientists communicate that it is not so obvious as one could think. There are many motivations, even in scientist communication, that we should study to understand non-obvious motivations. I'm wondering if Annette Leßmöllmann agrees with Massimiano and Sarah, and of course she wants to add something more from her perspective, which is also a linguistic perspective, I would say. Correct, Annette? I give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Nico, for the nice introductory words, and I'm very happy to see the audience. I would also like to be there, but the pandemic situation, especially in Germany, is not so nice. So I'm quite glad that I can just stay here in my little room. Thanks for Sarah and Massimiano for their very inspiring thoughts. I will try to add some points. You really addressed already a lot of topics. So I noticed during the last years, something which I find very important and relevant, that's a global view on science communication and on science. So the compare and contrast between different science cultures and science communication cultures seems to me fruitful in two ways. First of all, it opens up our view on things. Because in kind of older publications, you sometimes find science communication and science addressed as something monolithical or something universal. Like, this is science, how it is, or this is science communication, how it is. And I think it's very, very relevant and also intellectually challenging to look at what is it really universal, or aren't there a lot of things that are global, culturally coded, and of course also linguistically coded. And I think there are a lot of things to study within this. The next point I would like to make is who is doing science communication nowadays? Isn't it everyone? I watched a bakery bread vendor telling people to wear masks and using scientific knowledge to argue in front of her customers why they should wear their masks. So today, it can happen that everyone, a conductor in the train, etc., is talking about science stuff. So how are they handling it? How are they dealing with scientific knowledge? Is it something they use to just prove their point, or is it something they reflect on a daily basis? Is it something that changes their communication environment in any way? I think this is something that's very relevant. It's not just the mass media, we know that, because the media are everywhere nowadays. So I think we should have a look at this kind of communication. And then I notice a lot of new actors in science communication that maybe we should have a more closer look at. There are emerging a lot of new agents, like agencies, for example, public relation agencies that inform mayors and politicians, not only on the national level, but also on the local level, on science stuff. Sometimes someone is going to build a new power plant, and he is trying to base it on scientific knowledge. So how is the scientific knowledge used and how is it presented by these agencies? I think this is a very important point, because there are political decisions made upon this. So we have a lot of new actors, not only in the new media. We have very strong YouTubers who have millions of followers and who can do a lot of harm, but who also can do a lot of great work. There are some of these examples that are really doing great science communication, especially in the pandemic. But of course, it's also in the offline world that we have science communication used in different communication contexts. And concerning the way we do research, I think working together with people who are doing science communication can yield, well, we know it's mode 2 research, but it can also yield new forms of getting to your research questions and of dealing with it. And as a linguist, I would say it's important to take into account what role language can play. Think of Bourdieu's habitus. It's the use of the language, the way you speak to people. I'm doing some research with colleagues from South Africa, for example. It's so important which language you use, which dialect you use, the way you address people is very, very important. So I think this co-creative way of doing research is important. And on the other hand, very theoretical research, because I don't know, I don't think that we have a real theory of science communication yet. And it's also worth thinking about that. So not every research needs to be practically bound, but a big part of it should be.
Thank you very much, Annette. Since I would like to give the speech for some questions, I just want to, and for all of you, a brief comment about another topic that it usually recurs in discussion about science communication, the relationship between research and practice. I don't know if it is really an issue, but even in this room, in these days at our national conference on science communication, there are a lot of practitioners and also some people that in Italy study science communication. And every time we wonder if the relationship is good, or if there should be some relationships. Is it an issue? What is your opinion? Because I know that it's in a certain sense an old question, no? Which is linked to the communication studies, generally speaking. But we always, in a certain sense, risk to reinvent the wheel about this issue. So I want your from all of you, your opinion about this topic.
Yes, I will try to be very practical about this very broad question of study and practice. As a scholar, I think a very practical issue that we all, apparently care about today, that could be an example of fruitful connection, is the issue of quality of science communication. How do we tell the difference between good science communication and not so good or even bad science communication? And here I think we should definitely abandon what I call the heroic phase of science communication, where everything was okay in the name, provided it was science communication. If it's in the name of science, everything is okay. This, of course, is not true, like any other activity. There is, as I said, there are different qualities of science communication. But of course, the question which I've been thinking with other colleagues for about 10 years is, how do we tell the difference? And in the past, as you know, I mean, maybe until a couple of decades ago, or 10 years ago, this question was solved through the brand, basically. So if it's on the BBC, if it's in a reputable, well-reputed science museum, if it's in Super Quark, then it's good science communication. This is how we did it. Maybe mainly in the age of the mass media. Nowadays, of course, it's much more complex, and the responsibility about deciding what is the quality of science communication is very much on two actors. One are research institutions and scientists, and we have seen, unfortunately, during the pandemic, that many of them were not prepared for such an active role. But also on us as citizens, as users of science communication, we on the internet and social media, we always have to decide whether this is interesting, whether this is trustworthy, whether I should watch this video on YouTube or move on to something else. So I think we are in a new landscape, and let me say, of course, I don't have the time here to qualify this statement, but the most widespread way of solving this or addressing this issue of quality, the so-called fake news topic, for me is completely useless and misleading for a number of reasons that I can articulate. But maybe I can say here what, in my view, as I say, of course, I have a limited angle as a scholar of science communication, but some criteria of quality of science communication. Of course, accuracy is one of the criteria, but it's not the only one. And by the way, okay, I give you an example that I often notice with my students about, now we are all obsessed about the quality of communication in general, no, and fake news. Then I ask them, of course, but how have you ever paid for the quality of information? Have you ever paid 2 euros, 3 euros, 5 euros? The answer is no. So how can we expect, I mean, it is a paradox, that we expect quality of science communication when we're not prepared to pay it. Of course, there is a question of business, no? In journalism, some of you are journalists, they say, follow the money. Where does the money go? Who is making money with this? Of course, it's largely the big digital platform. And of course, they are not published. They don't consider themselves publishers, so they are not concerned with the quality of information. How can we expect that YouTube cares for the quality of science communication? It's impossible. The purpose is to keep as long as possible on the platform. That is the main thing. So I said accuracy, obviously we can agree. Clarity of aims, a lot of science communication is missing this point. What are we doing? What are we doing when we do the researchers' night? If you ask, even at my university, who knows a lot of things? Telling that science is important, encouraging young students to do a STEM career, raise the visibility of the profile of a university. These are different. They are all legitimate aims, but these are different. Clarity of aims, intelligence of audience. This was completely missing in the pandemic. We're talking about Italy as a country of anti-vaxxers, people hostile to science. In May this year, when the campaign had just started, we did one of the surveys of the Science and Society Monitor, and actually maybe also by chance, but we got exactly the result of 85% people willing to vaccinate, which is what is happening these days. And no vaxxers between 2 and 3%, both according to the Monitor and to the University of Milano. So anyway, and another point, of course, these are points for the discussion, is evaluation. whether science communication is evaluated. If it's not evaluated, at least for me, this is not a sign of good science communication. It should be evaluated according to the aims and also according to the point of view of the different actors involved. So not just the audience, but also the scientists. So this is my 10 cents or 50 cents, I don't know how you say about it.
Massimiano, thank you, especially for remembering us which are the real dimensions of anti-vaccine, it's called movement. Sarah, what's your opinion about this relationship between research and practice?
Yeah, I just pick up though briefly on one thing that Massimiano said, talking about quality. I have to give a shout out to the Quest project, which is a European project, quality and effectiveness, looking at quality and effectiveness in science communication, which I think is actually a great example of a collaboration between both researchers from different disciplines and practitioners from different kinds of spaces as well. But one of the things the Quest project did was develop indicators of quality through a process that involved research and researchers, but then was also tested with practitioners. So if you're interested, please do go and look at their website. Or I think Alessandra and Ilda are with you for the conference, so they can, I'm sure, tell you more. That was just the kind of riffing off the notion of quality. I mean, in terms of the relationship between research and practice, you're right, Nico. This has been talked about, I think, really since the beginning of studies of science communication and the beginning of it becoming a discipline or a field in its own right. It has been a really long-standing concern. And I guess we continue to talk about it because it does continue to be a challenge. I mean, I agree with everything that has been said. Annette, in particular, you emphasize the need for these collaborations and also spaces where research and practice can come together. I think it's really important, and for myself, I always benefit hugely from these conversations and collaborations. I think it's important to acknowledge, though, that it often does ask a lot of people. There is not so much money in science communication in most cases. People are often very busy with lots to do, lots to take on. And I think we have to kind of acknowledge that this is something that can be hard work. When you're talking and collaborating with people, it takes time and patience. Often I think there can be different aims in mind or different understandings of what a research problem is in a particular context. And so doing this kind of collaboration, setting up these better relations between research and practice, they do require trust and time. So I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that that as researchers in particular, we can often ask a lot of practitioners who are in very difficult or constrained situations. But this is more a structural challenge for how science communication is funded, the extent to which evaluation is funded and demanded, the extent to which these kinds of collaborations are acknowledged and supported in academic systems. So there are some challenges, but I think as researchers, this is something we should aim for, to try and find spaces and moments where we can engage with practice. I hope that makes sense. It felt a bit rambling.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope also this our meeting here in Italy is one of these pieces of collaboration, I guess, and I hope. Annette, what's your opinion about this topic?
Yeah, speaking from the perspectives, or taking the perspective of science communication researchers, I would add a shout out, and that is avoid the trap. We did a lot of research, saying we here, during the last decades on, for example, deficit model approaches. And so we as science communication researchers should not step into the trap of doing deficit model things. So that happens very easily. So the first thing I would say is be interested in what's going on out there and listen to what people say. I totally agree with Sarah that it's a matter of resources and time, etc. I mean, we share the problem with every researcher, that it's a matter of resources and time, but it's very relevant to listen to people, to engage with them, and to let yourself challenge by their questions, because the questions are from the outside of your scientific bubble, make you think maybe in another way. So not step in the trap, be interested, and then make yourself heard. I think we see in the pandemic that science of science communication researchers have the big privilege to have the broad view on what's happening. They address question of how society handles truth. They look at the media system and the evolving media system. They look at how science is changing. They have they address a lot of aspects that are very relevant, for example, in a pandemic situation. So talk to politicians and try to give them an idea of how science communication works. Write op-eds like Massimiano does in Italy, and make yourself heard. Don't stay in your box. And yeah, I think that would be the three main messages from my side.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette. Well, we have some minutes for questions from, there are already two hands. If you can stand up, please, and say your name.
Okay, I'm Gaia. I'm also here at CISA studying science communication. So I'm very, it's not easy to stand up here in the having everything, okay. So first of all, thank you very much for your speeches. Really, I am very interested in science communication. Of course, I'm here like all my colleagues, and in sociology of science. And I would like to ask a question. You already answered in a certain way, but I would like to point it more precisely. So in your opinion, is science communication more a descriptive job or a normative one? Like, is it more about what science communication is, or more about what science communication should be? What is, in your opinion, the right balance between those two approaches? And especially about the normative part, I would like to know and to deepen, is that more about what is more effective, like, I don't know, from the point of view of social psychology, or is it more about what should be more effective, what should happen, like, I don't know, sensationalism is bad. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Thank you. We start from, I don't know, Sarah or Annette wants to, please. Sarah or Annette?
I would just start. I think
okay.
Sarah can join. I would start with the first question. That is a very good question, because science communication is so much, the normative and the description is descriptive is so much intertwined in many activities, but also in research. I mean, you read a lot of papers where you find both all the time, and it's not separated. So I think the challenge for the theory of science communication, which has to be written, would be to sort this out and to say where are the descriptive parts and where are the normative parts. I think when we talk about it, and so thanks for giving also this feedback, we should always say, okay, now comes the normative part and now comes the descriptive part. And maybe there are parts where it's not discernible.
Maybe I'd add a brief comment.
We can't hear you, Sarah. Probably your microphone is switched off.
Maybe I just add a brief comment. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we couldn't hear you, but now it's okay.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Annette has said. I guess I would also circle back to this notion of the ecosystem that I pointed to earlier, because I think it's exactly necessary to have this wide variety of approaches. I think it's fine that some research is more normative and some research is more descriptive. I guess I would place myself more in the descriptive kind of strand of things. But I think it's also, you know, we need a diversity of approaches. And so I think to have those different perspectives is important. But what I think is vital then is that they are communicating with each other and acknowledging that that is not the only right way to do research. So I think, for instance, when we have approaches that are only exploratory and open and descriptive, and are also saying this is the only way to do this kind of study, this is unhealthy. So I think going back to this space of interaction and discussion as a way of perhaps fleshing out these questions of where should the balance be, to what extent should most research be descriptive or normative. I also think it's important, I mean, it's vital for all research to be reflective on its assumptions and the way that its methods shape its findings. But it's particularly the case here. I think often, as Annette maybe has gestured to, research in science communication is normative, but is not really acknowledging those strong normative commitments that are going into the research and are shaping what is being done. So I think it's important in reflecting on this balance that we are also reflecting on our practices and what they are doing to scholarship.
Totally agree. Thanks for chiseling that out.
I think there might actually be a third option that is interpretative as a typical epistemological option, not just describe, but also try to interpret, as in the case that, as in the example I made before, how to interpret these changes, for example, in the landscape of science communication. With regard to your question, I have to say I'm always puzzled by the question of effectiveness. Effective to do what? I mean, we know that one of the problems of the deficit model was, is science communication a tool for people to accept things they would politically not like to accept? In my view, this is not a good example of science communication.
Yes. Massimiano. Yes, Sasha, exactly. Very big point to discuss. What is the effectiveness? Okay, Sasha Borisova, please, Sasha.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Borisova, a science communicator. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Based between Italy and Russia, and I'm with Germany, and I'm, excuse me, I can get up because I have a baby.
Yes,
so,
we can see you.
My question is a bit following up the discussion Nico started about the role of scholars and the connection between scholars and practitioners. And it's about the ethics of science communication. So what do you think? Do we communicate the ethics of science communication to scientists? If we do, good, who does? If we don't do, who has to? What I mean is that I think scientists in the last, say, 10, 15 years lived this transition from science communication is more or less a hobby. It's like it's a hobby that is welcome, but it's not really compulsory, to the moment of now when it's a part of your profession. But do they really know why? Do they know, I mean, all the incentives that are incorporated into European grants and so on, of course they are done considering the ethics of science communication. But are we sure that scientists, I think so, yeah. That scientists know why they first they needed to incorporate science communication in their molecular application. Now it's already citizen science. And I suddenly see a lot of people wanting citizen science workshops that I do because, oh, citizen science, why? Do they know why? Do they know why they have now to engage? What is deficit model? What is an engagement model? And why? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alessandra. Please, someone wants to answer?
Nobody. That's scary.
I mean, I can respond briefly. I think they don't know why. The connection wasn't great, so I hope I'm not sure I caught everything that you said, but I think just anecdotally from my own experience, no, many scientists don't understand why. There remains a culture where science communication is kind of not understood, not talked about. It's something you do perhaps if you need to, but it's not particularly well integrated into a lot of research. In many cases, not all. This, I think, I mean, if I'm able to make a wish list of things that I would like to change in universities, I think we need to integrate this into education much more. Science communication skills, but also the ability to reflect on science and society and broader issues. I think this is the only way that we can craft a cultural change where scientists are perhaps more have more skills to think about why they are being asked to do these things and what they might bring to their research itself. Annette.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I hope I understood the question well. Thanks, Sarah, for pointing out that it should be part of studying science in general to reflect on society and science communication. But the question was, if I understood it well, why is that so? And do those people who study it know that it is like this, or can they skillfully challenge this assumption, which is also important? We have to kind of have an informed discussion on this in academia. So my question would be, is it only an ethical question of doing science communication, or are there other aspects? I mean, as you pointed out, science is changing, and maybe science communication will be considered part of science in the future. So is this just an inherent part? It's a job you do? Or is there any kind of obligation, be it ethical or not, that makes you engage into science communication? I think we need an educated discussion within academia, and we need a lot of knowledge about this, be it ethical and philosophical or just epistemological. That's an open question, but we need it.
Thank you, Massimo. Do you want to comment?
I agree. I think this is actually a policy question. I mean, it's should every scientist become a science communicator? I don't think so. I think this is not the way. I mean, we should respect the scientists who want to acknowledge the place of science communication and public engagement without engaging in this directly. I think it's important that they are aware of the science and society issues, and I would agree, and I think that it's a very more and more I see a lot of attention, for example, by doctoral students in different fields for having an understanding of what's going on in science and society. But then I think it should be, and this is for example, the challenge that the SCICOMM Master in Trento is taking. I think the universities and research institutions should have a strategy and public engagement activities, and they desperately need the skills of people like you to work with that, to work with the researchers.
An integration model, let's say. Well, we have space for just one question, a brief question, if there is one. In the middle of the room, brief question, please.
very much.
Please say your name and who you are.
Yes, so I'm Master I'm a researcher in climate psychology. And the question I have for you is, a lot of what science communication is about is really to allow the public to grasp on certain concepts that are otherwise pretty specific, pretty specialistic in a certain field. And another discipline that really takes care of trying to make a concept more fruitable to the public and more understandable is marketing, which is done more in the industry point of view. And I'm wondering, how do you, from an academic point of view, see the communication with the marketing field? Do you see that it can be advantageous for the two fields of science communication and marketing to speak to each other and possibly help each other develop? Well, I'm thinking more from, can it be advantageous for science communication to grab some marketing tools to simplify the concepts that are being communicated? Or do you see it more as this enemy of communicating to sell rather than communicate to inform?
Thank you. Massimiano wants to answer first.
I think there is already a lot of it. I mean, if you go to the social media page of many research institutions, you will find a lot of marketing. That's what they do. I mean, if you're asking the question, does this increase, for example, the understanding of the research done at that institute, I would be skeptical. But of course, I mean, it's an open question. What are the consequences? But it's obviously that there is a lot of marketing activities to raise the brand and the visibility of the institutions. And of course, we know that nowadays science is more and more interconnected, research at the edge with business. So of course, I mean, this is done.
Sarah or Annette want to add? Please, Annette.
I think it's a research question to really find out how strategic communication and non-strategic communication interact, and what do they do to each other. I think that is a very fundamental thing we will have to sort out in the next years, because it's so much coming together. Look at YouTubers that are successful. Of course, they use certain strategies, like sitting in front of people, being personal, being accountable for what they say, etc. And this is very successful. So other people, also institutions, try to copy that and use these tools and techniques. And what does this do to science communication? I think we should really closely monitor that.
I did some research recently, or I was involved in some research recently, where we interviewed scholars and teachers of science communication about their thoughts on the contemporary science communication landscape. And this is one thing that came up repeatedly, that they were very critical of, this kind of trend towards marketing in science communication. So science communication as persuasion and branding. I have to say, I think if you look at the literature, the research literature in marketing, it is much more sophisticated. So kind of from an academic perspective, I think there could be some interesting conversations there. As Annette says, I think we need more research in this, both what the landscape is like and where it's taking us to.
Well, okay, I think that we can stop here, and I really thank Massimiano Bucchi, Davies and Annette Leßmöllmann. I really hope that we have another chance to have you here in presence in Italy to continue our discussions and our our possibility of exchanges ideas. Thank you very much, and see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.